Hello. Come in, do, and make yourselves at home. This is the History of Ideas podcast, where we tackle some of the biggest questions around. This week, we're asking the question, what is justice? Here it is.
In a previous life, I was a prison governor. On behalf of the state, I had the power to lock people up for long periods of time. And often I'd question, why had I this right to inflict punishment on others who were just as much part of society as I was? More worryingly, I was sometimes in a position when I was locking people up who were engaged in nothing more than civil disobedience, who just didn't agree with the state. The thinker who's our touchstone here is Thomas Hobbes, the first modern philosopher to ask the questions, what's the state for? How does it get its power? And in what circumstances can we disobey it?
What is justice?
Thomas Hobbes was an English political philosopher of the 17th century whose social contract theory was hugely influential in the Age of Enlightenment. He wrote on the rights of the individual and the equality of all men, and the importance of a strong system of law. Hobbes wrote in the aftermath of the English Civil War and suggested that a life without government would be a war of all against all. The only way to avoid this was for individuals to surrender their autonomy to a sovereign who had total power over them. He was said to have been born prematurely, as his frightened mother heard of the approach of the Spanish Armada.
What is justice?
How do you find peace out of war?
This is Robin Douglas, Hobbes expert at King's College London.
And that, I think, is the driving question that animates Hobbes' philosophy, is how do we live in peace rather than war? How do we avoid living in a state of nature? A state of nature is nasty and brutish and short for Hobbes. The idea is that our natural passions lead us into conflict with other people.
What Hobbes calls a state of nature is a situation where there is no government, no rules, and where we're all at each other's throats. Can we actually find a state of nature today? Perhaps in places like Eastern Congo, or closer to home for many of our children, online computer games. Here's gaming expert Esther McCallum-Stewart.
There are games where, particularly in public servers, people really feel that it's a free-for-all. And they do behave very badly. A typical example is people logging onto a public server where they don't know anybody and destroying other people's property.
You can't even double-cross fellow players because they'll double-cross you first.
See, I was thinking about backstabbing sooner, but then they just attack me. So, I kind of can't do much.
It's very common in early games, for example, when they're first formed, to just see people randomly running around, killing each other randomly. It's not a nice situation to be in.
Everybody either tries to backstab you or just attack you straight on.
Hobbes recognised this problem exactly and thought you needed to have someone in absolute charge. Then you'd have a state, or as he called it, a commonwealth run by a sovereign.
You give up the right of governing yourself to someone else, to the sovereign, to the ruler. And the thought is that if we can somehow contract together, then you could get out of a state of nature and into a commonwealth.
Hobbes is talking about forming what's usually called a social contract. It doesn't actually matter to him whether the body in charge, the sovereign, is a dictator, a monarch, or even a parliament. The point is that we all agree to put someone in charge.
As long as there's one body or one person that's authoritative about making laws and enforcing them, for Hobbes, that's all you need.
Did he actually see there being an explicit agreement with the individual, or is this just hypothetical?
I don't think he saw this as something that did actually happen at any historical moment in time. I actually think Hobbes is trying to do something very interesting and different to that. I think he's trying to say that, in a sense, there's a kind of logical necessity to thinking about the state in these contractual terms, so that if we understand the nature of the state, we should see ourselves as consenting. The claim isn't that we explicitly consent, it's more that we implicitly consent. If you receive the protection of the state, if you enjoy the benefits of living in a secure civil order, then you owe the state your obedience.
But how would the individual then, if the state was behaving in a way with which they fundamentally disagreed, how would the individual remove his consent?
Well, I guess part of Hobbes' argument is to say that actually that's not something that really should happen.
So we have to obey the state because the alternative is anarchy. Where does that leave conscience? A case that bothers me is that of Stephen Goff, the so-called naked rambler. He spent much of the last decade in prison because he insists on being naked in public. A BBC documentary followed him during one of his rare spells of freedom.
Stephen was only released half an hour ago.
Just a joke, is it?
No, no. Release me, arrest me again. I just don't really understand that.
Stephen has been arrested so many times over the last 10 years. It's reported to have cost the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds.
I'm standing for freedom. It's about freedom. It's about prejudice and intolerance.
Stephen Goff is currently in Winchester Prison. I went to speak to his lawyer, Mike Schwartz.
He just wishes to walk around naked the way he was born and the way that we are. And I suppose he wants to transfer into the public area what we all do at some stage in the private area.
So this is about his relationship to the state. Don't we all, in some way, in return for protection from the state, have some obligations about what's regarded as normal within that state, within that culture? And to ramble nakedly in the city centre, which he has tried to do on a number of occasions, surely breaches his obligation to the rest of us.
Stephen appears to fall into a wrinkle in the system. Stephen, never bought into this process. It's imposed upon him. It's not a contract in the sense that that term is normally used, that it's an agreement between one person and the other. The social norms, backed up by legal force, are imposed upon him under sanction of criminal law and incarceration. And I think what his position would be is that there should be some tolerance, some flex, some human rights within this contract.
Doesn't that apply to us all? None of us signed up in some formal way to the social contract. But ultimately, there is a state that is there to protect us. And wouldn't Stephen Goff be knocking on your door if he was attacked when he was nakedly rambling about?
The question really is, how far should the state go? And are Stephen's activities so abhorrent, so dangerous to the state that they ought to be criminalised and result in incarceration and years in custody?
Back to Hobbes scholar Robin Douglas.
Would Hobbes have been able to recognise individual dissent because of a political or a moral integrity?
The short answer is no. I mean, he wanted to argue that people pay too much attention to the dictates of their conscience. So he argued that actually conscience is just judgment. And we can't live in a world, he thought, where people disagree about things fundamentally. One of the purposes of the sovereign is to bring such disagreement to an end.